Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Varsha Mishra, a research intern at the Institute of Chinese Studies, and I have the honor of serving as today's Master of Ceremony. I extend a warm welcome to each one of you joining us for yet another insightful session of ICS Wednesday Seminar Series. Today's seminar is titled Political Echo Chambers and Misinformation in Digital China. Since 2013, the measures to align the digital discourse along with the party lines have been intensified by the Chinese government. This endeavor is reflected in the extensive reach of the state over digital information in foreign nations, coupled with its substantial intervention across social, political, cultural, and economic digital dialogues. Resultantly, skepticism has emerged about the reliability of virtually all accessible digital information. This complex landscape gains heightened significance within the context of China's status as an exemplar active digital society. This ensuing discussion is of great significance, hence demands thorough discussion. In light of this, Dr. Tilak Jha, the speaker of today's seminar, will delve into how the government's control over digital information has made people question the accuracy of the information available. He will also explore how this control has influenced the digital landscape to align with the Communist Party's ideas. Dr. Tilak Jha is an associate professor at the Times School of Media, Bennett University. With numerous book chapters to his name, he is a regular contributor to media, foreign relations, and policy discussions. In his latest work includes a chapter titled COVID-19 Wave 2, The Disinformation Challenge. 2023 for the book How India Coped with the Second Wave of COVID-19, edited by Antara Chaudhary and Jayanti Datta and published by Cambridge Scholars Publishing. The chair for today's session is Dr. Usha Chandran, who is an honorary fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies and is also an assistant professor at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. With notable publications, including book chapters and journal articles, she is presently working on an authored book, Gender Discrimination at Work in Urban China, and an edited volume titled Gender in Language and Expression. Now, before I hand over the session to the chair, I would request all the participants to adhere to a few housekeeping rules. All the participants should be muted throughout the presentation. Questions can be posted in the chat box, or one can also use the raise hand feature on Zoom during the session. After the presentation, when invited, unmute yourself and ask your question concisely. Please mention your name and affiliation while posing the question. With that, I now hand over the session to the chair, Dr. Chandran. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you, Varsha. I think it's very interesting today, and I'm very fortunate that I've been, asked to chair this session, even though initially I thought this is not my expertise. But as I read Tilak's abstract, I think it's absolutely a field where all China observers would be, have worked on it or looked at it. So I think all of us, whoever has looked at China knows, that, how the state surveillance is like, the Chinese state practice of strict and stringent surveillance on social media, control over the social media, which works at two levels, as Tilak had also mentioned. But I think for me, it is, as I look at it, I think, and I think many of you will agree that it was actually the height of or the extent of this state surveillance was realized when during the COVID time, when during the pandemic or during the zero COVID policy, that what can be the extent of this kind of surveillance, and that how the state can actually indulge in misinformation, and which could be, misleading the public to the state narrative, or creating a positive image of the situation, having the search engines, exploiting even the search engines to create a certain kind of narrative and using keywords and everything. However, when I was just looking at these issues, what interested me, or one of the news that I saw, which is like during this year, May and June, I think they have had a huge crackdown on social media accounts. And, Cyberspace Administration of China has actually cracked down more than 100,000 accounts, which they're saying that it is fake. They're basically accounts which are making fake news, and and they're actually impersonating as the state-controlled media. In fact, they are being accused of disguising as the state-controlled media themselves, and and acting as the authoritative media, news media, and apparently they're using AI also for this purpose. But it's interesting that how this contrast works, because on the one hand there is a strict control, and on the other hand, so much of its number is actually very interesting, because in all of them, when you take a closer look, then you realize that not all of them are actually being shut down for fake news. There are accounts which are being shut down because they have a lot of followers, or they are making profit out of their account, or they are sensationalizing certain news. They're discussing social issues, so therefore they were attacked, and they were actually asked to shut down. So it's interesting for me to look at this whole topic, and how Tilak is going to look at this issue. I'm really looking forward to it, because the contrast in this whole idea of state control and the upsurge of actors actually speaking or expressing is very interesting. So now I invite Tilak to present his talk, and we'll be very looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Varsha, for this generous introduction. I think before I go ahead, I would possibly include a sharing of the slide, which possibly takes some attention away. Am I clearly audible?
Yes, you are.
So I think before we start talking about how China works, or for that matter, how media works, and how this entire misinformation and disinformation things work, a couple of things. One of the easiest thing, and one of the possibly most simple thing to figure out possibly, is that what is information and what is disinformation and what is misinformation. So I think in very rough terms, we can say that as far as misinformation is concerned, it is something that is done not with malicious intent. It's like a mistake in sharing an information link. And disinformation, for that matter, when there is an information which is not really of any, it's not something of the useful information, and it's something actually negative information, and it's done with a malicious intent. So these are the basic, some of the basic definitions as far as information is concerned. I think what we are talking here is primarily going actually in the domain of both, I would say, because when we generally don't really link information, misinformation and disinformation as two separate things in our public conversations, I think for today's conversation as well, I would say that in many ways we will be actually talking interchangeably. Now, I think what essentially we should start possibly is one of the best examples when we are talking about China and its propaganda mechanism comes from Russia. And I think those of you who have possibly followed Russia a bit, you would, I think you would have definitely noted the fact that Russia happens to be the first country which used propaganda at a scale that it did. In a huge country, doing like anything, it was like nothing before was done, something like that. And this journey started with a mathematician whose name was Victor Glushkov. So he possibly imagined for the first time what is called a super state, and which would possibly help keep track of thousands of industrial and agricultural enterprises. And this is where propaganda started conceptualizing the propaganda mechanism in which a state with modern tools and technologies is willing to use digital tools to the extent that it can control literally every single industrial and agricultural enterprise. Of course, the Soviets were not able to pull it off because of primarily two factors, or rather three main. One, they didn't have the economical wherewithal to sort of pull it off. The second major factor was that it was a huge country. So it was a huge country, so just even creating infrastructure of that scale and sort of maintaining track of it would have been an immense challenge. So that was not feasible. I think another aspect to it was also the fact that the ministries or the bureaucracy, which had to implement these policies, their interest was not necessarily in line with the state's interest of promoting, say, agenda of the state. So ministries were very happy doing what they were doing and possibly having their own way at times whenever they wanted. But if all the information flow from the ground till the top was channelized in a way so that there is no gap and it reaches without any major, major intervention in between, then any person at the top, one who is in the leadership, they can easily not just keep track of what is happening, but can also ensure how to get rid of the issues that props up in between. And by the way, the Russians tried to, there were other people who tried to sort of take it further. It started possibly with Anatoly Kitov, and there were a couple of others. It has been mentioned in one of the very famous books by Benjamin Peters, how not to network a nation, the uneasy history of the Soviet internet. By the way, why I'm trying to tell this story is that, and how it possibly its inference with China is concerned, that these are the plugs which China has tried to fix. Okay, essentially they have got technology, and I think in today's time it would be fair to say that in some of the most sophisticated technologies related to not just information but also AI, artificial intelligence, China happens to be one of the world leaders, and it has certain advantages compared to some of the other parts because of the kind of information which they can simply sort of extract or sort of mandate without any significant legal or say other challenges, which is the case in most democracies, where if you try to possibly get information beyond a certain level, there could be privacy issues, there could be a public outcry. And of course, at the end of the day, you have to go back to the people and get votes after 4, 5 years, 6 years, whatever is the political system. In China's case, the state and even the corporate sector could therefore amass information, unbelievable amount of information compared to most democratic and Western countries for sure. But it also was set up where the hierarchy was very, very lopsided in favor of those whom we generally call the elite sections of the society, or in China's case, the ruling dispensation and their stakeholders, or for that matter, those who work with them closely. So there was little doubt about the amount of data which they could gather. So that was one advantage. Technological advantage is definitely there. Economically, China is the world's second biggest economy. It continues to grow at a significant rate. For the past 40 years, it has remained there. One of the fastest growing economy. So that thing has been largely taken care of. There was one major gap, which of course was the fact that if there was a conflict of interest between people who implement the laws and regulations or enforce it, and where the information has to reach, if they come in clash, how to plug that thing up. The Chinese have done a phenomenal job at that too, by running dedicated propaganda campaigns from time to time. And I think the amount of stress whenever you read a Chinese newspaper or listen to the conversations which happen in Chinese cybersphere, the amount of ideological heavyweight that you have to carry, possibly for most of the stories that you read, is because of that. Young generation in China also resisted at times, but I think this is what they have stuck with. And more or less, so far, if you see the public opinion surveys, they have done it really well. So I think this is the context in which we have to see how China, which at the same time is one of the world's most successful countries, not just economically, but also in terms of expanding digital connectivity, has been able to what we can call a digital China very much. And what we can also use the terms such as digital socialism, maybe, or for that matter, with CPC at the top, with the Communist Party of China at the top of it. So going forward, I think what we see on this slide is how the misinformation thing works. It works in many ways. On the top, you have laws and regulations. I've just noted down the major ones. There are many additions to these laws over the years. There have been many amendments which have happened. So the most recent one is, of course, the deep fake, which regulation has happened this year itself. Since January, they have started it. The first draft came out for public consultation last year, and since then it has picked up momentum. Now they have also brought out rules and regulation related to generative AI. In this respect, China not just wants to control, for that matter, make sure that deepfake doesn't get out of hand, but also the fact, and I think one of the fact that today's chair pointed out towards the sort of imitation of state news channels or these platforms, deepfake is going to make it very, very easy. And this has happened everywhere, but with advancement of deepfake, this is going to be some sort of a norm, actually. And this is where I think the Chinese concerns are. That is one. And I think another thing that they're also trying to make sure is that they want to remain at the top of AI leadership globally. And this is where the next generation of technology, they want to make sure that when it comes to regulation, to be the rule setter, then the Chinese are looked up to. The Chinese rules are looked up to. And I think the way we see privacy laws, GDPR, European Union norms are more or less the global standard. China definitely aims at having the next generation of technology for it to be looked at. And of course, there are other laws related to data security, privacy, cybersecurity, and all of this. Now, the second dimension beyond laws and others is, of course, censorship and propaganda, which is not something new. It has been going on. Traditionally, there were other means of doing censorship and propaganda. When it was print, it was different. When it was television, it was different. When it was radio, it was different. But of course, there were wall paintings and textbooks. They were there. There were also censorship, and those things were there. But roughly around 2000, when this digital thing became prominent, this has attained new dimension. And this is where I think this was the time possibly where China also started going global to the extent. So earlier it was mostly limited to local, national boundaries. Now, with digital boundaries being broken, China is very much, and the Chinese censorship and propaganda as well, actually is going far beyond its shores. And we have definitely heard about different stories about planting of stories, and not just that. Of course, the usual mechanism was CPD, the Central Propaganda Department. It started with firewall in the digital domain. It aims at controlling or sort of regulating, to use the official term, anything related to communication or say media, which is related to creation of it, reproduction of the content, publishing of it, and of course dissemination. And I think when you go beyond, if you see the kind of things which is on the top priority of the leadership and the CPC is usually related to historical issues, political issues, and primarily around the positioning of the party and the leadership. But at the same time, what we have also seen is that in recent times, the Chinese have been very, very actively promoting their versions of borders, of South China Sea, related issues, Line-Line, and several other aspects of it. There are genuine concerns related to socio-economic order maintenance, safeguarding of national security, and of course, public interest and legitimate rights of those who follow the Chinese laws, the government's laws, and other things. And I think those of us who follow the Chinese propaganda, we also know for sure that politically being correct is not something that's a expectation which you are simply supposed to follow, but it's a mandate. It's something which is enforced through propaganda in a big way. And as is the case with most dominant consensus mechanism, the Chinese believe in propaganda to sort of push the state's agenda and to make sure that people believe in it. The government officials believe in it, the military believes in it, and other stakeholders who help the party and the state to continue its dominance over China, they believe in it. And this has been over the years, in recent years in particularly, it has been interestingly linked to morality, values, and such terms. This is also becoming prominent after the decades of cultural revolution. This is something which has become which has tended to head more towards Confucianism and traditional Buddhism rather than anything else. So that is it. I think when it comes to social media, we definitely see one of the key concerns related to rumors and private chat groups. Now, as far as controlling that is concerned or regulating that is concerned, there are different dimensions of it. From authentication and verification mechanism, which possibly is one of the world's most rigorous in terms, if you compare. I think if you have to open a Facebook or Twitter account in Delhi, you don't need, in India, you hardly need anything beyond your email or Facebook account maybe. But if you want to do it in today's China, on most of the social media will possibly need you far more documentation. That also helps tracking, that also helps keeping a digital footprint, that also make sure that whenever there are issues or such a situation, there's a rumor, then complaint can be raised and complaint can be tracked. There is a security assessment from time to time, and it can be periodically assessed. Periodic review of the process can be done. And if you see what it affects in general, or for that matter, the dimensions where all these things can become important can be literally almost anywhere. To be social, political, cultural, economical, and of course, technological and environmental, and trade and technology related misinformation as well. By the way, I think what we generally would focus upon, and I think, is that two aspects of misinformation has been very, very prominent since the digital became prominent. And it started possibly with environment, because that was the time, I think, in the early 2000s when China's pollution became a big story, started becoming a big story. And it started making the headlines. So one of the earliest stories which actually made into the cybersphere in terms of disinformation thing was actually climate related. Politics and economics, politics was always there for that matter. There was always factionalism and contest, which has become possibly worse in recent years. But political news making it to the public sphere, especially in digital sphere, has become far more challenging than when it was in the pre-digital era, where possibly you could print some newspaper. It would possibly take some time, at least some time for it to reach the top leadership. But in today's case, that gap is gone. So it has become far more efficient. This is where I think we don't see really much of political misinformation coming out in the public on the mainland China. From the rest of the world and from platforms, several other platforms who track China's situation, I think the way it works. I think we definitely keep getting know about it, and it has, and that's where the political misinformation related limitation is. But economic has started catching up, and we'll talk about it. So let's start with the climate one. I think what you see primarily on this slide is something related to rising temperatures and it being linked to prosperity by terming the fact that in the previous Chinese version, in the version of previous Chinese empires, for example, in case of Han and Tang dynasty as well, there was a situation when you had warmer climates brought more prosperity. By the way, the state media actually try to counter those misinformation, but the fact that there are such arguments But I think we also have to be very, very careful that this is not something that happens in China alone. This happens everywhere. But the way China deals with this information, this information and misinformation is something very, very different. So I think what we notice in these slides in general, which is an official site primarily, which is run by the China Ministry of Ecological Environment, is that these things are also counter, but these are also becoming very, very prominent. And these are kind of a stuff which is not just coming from mainland China, they're also coming from dedicated platforms which are abroad, and many, as Professor Chandan also pointed out, websites which are impersonated, maybe. And I think going forward, what you also see is that there is a constant debate going on in China about these aspects. There have been papers which have been written about climate change skepticism. And one interesting aspect what we see is that climate change skepticism in China's case has been guided very much by the state's nationalistic interpretation of climate change. So I think when in the early 2000s, till the time China was not really focusing upon climate change as much as it is doing today, what they were trying to, most of the climate conversation essentially happened about opposing Western countries, claiming that, well, Western countries have developed themselves and they don't want China to develop. That sort of discourse was flowing. But in recent years, when China started changing its track, now they have started also country. Of course, there are issues related to like revitalization, which is an ongoing theme in the case of China. I think post Ukraine war, what we also see for that matter is that food production has risen as another concern. I think recently there have been official messaging that fair enough, we need to make sure that land under agriculture doesn't keep going down. That moreover, I think there have been several fake images circulated in several parts in all across Chinese media about parks, for that matter, being converted into agricultural land, and that sort of stuff has also started coming up. And this is then propaganda which goes international as well. So there is a lot of news about Greta Thunberg, maybe saying at times also presenting her very differently, at times presenting her image as not the way she actually looks. Those efforts have also been there. These are intriguing narratives actually, which tries to shape public opinion in line with the state's narratives and in line with to make sure that it remains nationalist, it remains a agenda which primarily is in line with the government. Okay. And going forward, what you again see is something related to the same aspect that climate change evokes. These conversations tend to become very, very prominent whenever there is a different focus. And it has always been there for that matter, but what we have seen in China's case is that it has been used also to support the state's validity, the party state's sort of legitimacy in a way. And conspiracy theories have become very, very prominent. There are other aspects of which, including on the front of diplomacy, for example, what we see in this slide essentially is there was a news in January that the Chinese have essentially offered ambulance to Ukraine. But the fact was that these photos were 5 years old. There was nothing like that. So these are also, verification has also picked up, fact check has also picked up. There has been debate over security issues and military-related issues are some of the another aspect which receives a lot of attention in Chinese media, and the government is also very, very careful about these. For example, what you essentially see here is about 4 proposed laws. The initial version came in October 2022 on the NPC WeChat account. And after that, it was actually something where the state was not saying something, but something new. It was actually saying the usual stuff in terms of having reservationists, military, which is in reserve and their retirement age related data, and of course mandating military service for people who are 18 years of age. So there was a lot of confusion about it, not from the side of the state, but many websites picked it up and they tried to sort of give an image that now it's being mandated. Military services are going to be almost like a conscription for everybody above 18, and it led to a lot of debate. And of course, the Chinese government takes these stuff very, very seriously. There have been questions related to, at times, for example, what you see on this slide is one reporter whose designation appeared at times on in different ways. At one place, she was a reporter. At another, she appeared as a military personnel. So another as a squad leader. So what you see here is different types of designation, and this also led to all sorts of confusion and misinformation. So I think there are all sorts of misinformation on every next issue that you know. And of course, the biggest of all, which Professor Chandana also pointed out, was related to COVID. It was not just one, actually, there were many. This is not from mainland China, Hong Kong, actually. But of course, it led to controversy in China as well, and in Hong Kong as well. Most of these news get censored, but it remains, okay? But what this slide also points out is the political nature of controversies, political nature of misinformation. All of these misinformation is not simply a challenge for government in making sure that the information reaches, but it's also a challenge of the political nature of what disinformation or misinformation can actually do. And for that matter, in China, politics is a huge taboo. So anything like this is not expected. The Chinese censors, for that matter, even cannot tolerate the sight of Winnie the Pooh actually anymore. It's possibly one of the most censored images on China since Barack Obama and Xi Jinping were linked to this image. It actually became almost vanished, right? So doesn't mean, for that matter, when we see all these images, or for that matter, when we not necessarily see political controversies originating, or for that matter, it not being written extensively as having a political nature, at least in the mainland China, doesn't mean it's not there. It's in the plain sight. It's actually not even hidden, for that matter. And well, it keeps on coming through other options. Now, if you see this next slide, this was a website which was supported by Tencent and Tingshan Yuan. It's primarily a private platform which used to debunk the use of traditional medicine for virus, and it was suspended. And it was possibly one of the most popular platforms before it was suspended. 30 million followers on different social media app of this platform. But this well-read health information outlet was shut down, not because it used to debunk traditional medicine, but because it started countering government's promotion of traditional Chinese medicine, especially when this zero COVID policy was there. And after that, it was suspended from popular social media platform. And its account has more or less remained silent since then. If you remember, one of the most famous figures of the COVID era, Dr. Chun Nanshan, his stand himself, the way, initially, I think he definitely did a very good job. I think the Chinese government gave him quite a bit of leeway in implementing the policies that he wanted, but at the same time, I think towards the towards the later period, what we also realize is that he started possibly saying things which were not very, very simple. And he started telling even the state media towards the end of 2022, maybe around when China was still under quarantine sort of thing, when they were still intent on zero COVID policy, that it was not really something to worry about. So you see, from one extreme that the virus was such a dangerous thing, to another extreme where COVID-19 was not really a threat. It was just like another flu. This dramatic change in the statement, while possibly that China was still not very much ready. This itself points out to the way information mechanism works in China and the gaps in between. So there are so many gaps actually. These gaps, I think, needs to be plugged from time. And this is also related to COVID about Shanghai lockdown, and it didn't really again it again had to fall in line with the state. Now I think COVID is something that's fresh in our mind. Politics we talked briefly about. We saw environment-related stuff, and of course we saw military-related information. What we also need to point out, I think in recent years, what has happened is that economic news, which was something of an exception, not till long ago actually, because the Chinese government even officially accepted that. And it was also visible in the kind of amount of freedom the Shanghai newspapers at times, or at least business newspapers, enjoyed compared to political newspapers. But then this started changing in 2015. And that was the stock market crash in 2015 when it led to the kind of fall which has never happened since 2007. And 2015 was not a year when possibly the current leader would have wanted market to go like that. And the government cracked like anything. I think one of the scapegoats that we found was Wang Xiaolu, who was a Caixin reporter. And he was put on national television primarily to confess that his story earlier on 20th of July was primarily something that actually led to the situation, led to the market ultimately ending up in crash. So we actually see even economic news has not been left over the years. And in recent years, the cases have increased. Around that time, in August 2015, for example, stock market was one of the most censored terms. And this was not just one example. There are several examples. I think it has become more of a norm rather than exception. And we consistently keep noticing about it. And what we also see on this slide is again something similar about the message from Central Propaganda Department at the same time to report stuff related to economy positive. Of course, this was a leak, so this was not something that will be reported officially, but it has been there. Quite a bit of it has been there. I think in recent years, more doubt has been about China. Okay, so I think what we see is that hardly any stuff on as far as news is concerned is not really untouched, and this has become worse in recent years. So when we mention the terms such as which is the headline of today's topic, political echo chambers, it's essentially around that, because what we have also seen over the last decade in particular, since the current leader has gained in power, is that more and more censorship, more and more domains which are facing greater amount of censorship, and the heightening of what we can call political echo chamber. So even till last year, there was a gentleman called Li Keqiang, who was the prime minister, who, for that matter, was from a different faction in case of Chinese politics, and there was some conflicts. But in recent years, what we have seen, I think since then, it has become worse. So despite China being one of the most active digital society, whether it be social issues, whether it be economic issues, whether it be environmental issues, or almost any issue, this is all something where there are all legal, political, and technological mechanisms are put in place to make sure that that echo chamber, which is created because of the rhetoric which is done by anybody, is primarily to support the party and its leader. Okay, and that is something which is reaching worrying proportion. There can be little doubt about that. What we see on this slide is primarily broad summations of what we discussed so far. Primarily is that, and I think it would be fair to point out, by the way, at the outset, that despite all these gaps that we may have pointed out, state-led media is still the most authoritative. And why is it so? It is because of the fact that CCTV, Xinhua, and People's Daily, the three primary platforms, which in a way run all the major political and economic news related, they're at the top of this chart. They're at the top of this hierarchy. So they are possibly, their versions are not really counted in today's chart. There is one exception or two exceptions in terms of chiting, maybe here and there once in a while, but that space has also become less. And digital China, for that matter, if we talk about that, is rife with misinformation. There's nothing, there's almost every single domain. Political health and security is, of course, the top concern. Health is definitely, after COVID, there's little doubt, but health is not something that has happened for the first time. There have been earlier cases as well. There was SARS related, there were swine flu related cases earlier, where again, this tendency to control information, especially even through in the digital era, has backfired. And political and national trust is something that we mentioned, that this is one of the key driving factors around which the misinformation mechanism works. And I think the general agenda is again clear, that always the goal is to make sure that the government, especially the senior leaders, and the top leader is definitely untouchable as far as putting any blame is concerned. So that remains deflected from them. Any blame remains deflected from them. So it has always all been there. Somehow, Chinese social media has also been a platform for people to express their dissatisfaction, but this situation is also facing more and more censorship. So this is leading, by the way, to limitation of the scope for alternative discourse, which was one of the key spaces, exit spaces. Not just people found exits in terms of expressing their concern, but even for the government, actually, it created a channel where they got feedback from the ground. But with this space being constantly pushed further to the corner, what we see is that there is the echo chamber at the top level, at the top leadership of the party, is becoming far and far, it's becoming a bigger channel. It's becoming a bigger balloon. There are less, this is possibly one of the government which is represented by least number of factions in several decades, for that matter, since the time of Mao era, would be fair to say. And of course, this is the government which has the biggest amount, the most sophisticated technology at its disposal. And this is also the government which is possibly, in a way, in a time where China's global role is possibly the most significant. So I think there are not just going to be domestic fallouts of these issues, there are going to be global fallouts of the Chinese country. And this is concerned, this is not something that the Chinese don't realize it, at least in the academic discourse. This is something that has been also raised by Western countries at times, that this is actually going to backfire. This is actually going to be against the interest of even the economic interest of China's partnering countries, including China's biggest trade partner, US, which has raised this issue with a lot of stress from time to time. And of course, media use and media trust related issues are there in general, but what we also see, for that matter, that trust in media is something that is linked to consistency, that is linked to subjects, and that's also linked to the system. And I think that's where we see the first point here, that authoritative media remains the government. And I think this is something which has become very, very prominent during COVID, for that, because there are a lot of misinformation. So information and misinformation, if you see it as an ecosystem, I should have possibly put in some charts here. It's like information and misinformation ecosystem works like this. If there's too much information in private spaces beyond the government, possibly the government information ecosystem tends to become more reliable and more trustworthy. So, for example, during COVID, there was so much of information everywhere related to COVID, related treatment, quacks, everything, treatment quacks, and of course, the figures of deaths, and not just that, was that the government taking the command of providing information at a regular span, almost regularly, in a reliable way, invited people's attention, and that became the most reliable platform. But if it was usually the other way around, then of course the private players can become prominent. But what we also see, for that matter, that those who rely on, say, in China's case, those who rely on traditional state media, they not just believe the government rhetoric, but they also believe in the government's agenda and what the government said, not just during COVID, but also its politics about its wider agenda in China and beyond China. But those who do not necessarily have consider, say, a state media authoritative, they tend to be more suspect about the state. And this is where I think the consistent effort to make sure that even the private communication spaces, private WeChat groups maybe, or for that matter, as far as possible, private WeChat groups are very difficult to actually sort of regulate, like Weibo, which is a public platform. At least the public platform for sure, they adhere and there are less of controversy against the government. So these are some of the findings, and of course there are evolving methods that government definitely keeps on doing. So this is one slide. I think there are 2-3 slides which I'll take another 3-4 minutes to just wrap it up. This is about fact check, and what you see interestingly here is that in China, so many people are actually able to do fact check far more than Taiwan, far more than Singapore, even Japan for that matter. So it can also lead to certain questions. Is that and this some of the questions I have to put here is that does having a more trusted political mechanism pushes people in comfort zones? So is there anything like that? And does it make people more susceptible towards misinformation and disinformation compared to some situations such as in Vietnam or in China, where people already have a mechanism where they possibly doubt so many things? So they are far more adept at fact checking or making sure that the news that they get is correct. Misinformation is not only a problem for the people, it's possibly a far bigger problem for the government. And the government, which has less transparent information flow mechanism, need to be far more careful. So far, the Chinese have done a very good job at making sure that the governance and the government doesn't really remain far disconnected from the people. But they have the experience of the Russia for that, what we discussed initially. But what we also see is that in recent years, everything has inclined towards the political. So that is one. If you see the nature of traditional media, in traditional media, even the rumors or the trust, they had a bigger shelf life. You read a newspaper, you read a rumor, you believe in it for far longer period. But in the now era that we live, including in the tiny social media space, where social media is it's a far more vibrant space than so many other countries, what we see is that social media can deal with rumors and fact with equal speed, but at the same time, it's also gradually leading to a situation where people are having less and less patience about simply persisting with any of it. So the government needs to be far more quicker in sort of countering the rumor and facts, and that is where actually the gaps also tend to happen, which is where I think whenever something new happens, they are taken, the government, or for that matter, the censors end up being taken aback. Those situations can also be there. And I think the last but not the least, that whatever of these cycles of enforcements and rules and violations could be, what it can actually do is that possibly it can raise threat for the CPC's biggest project to be accepted as the natural party of governance, so to be almost compared as almost having a mandate to continue to rule China. So what would be the problems and solutions? So if we have to sum it up in 3 major points, that what are the limitations of this misinformation system is possibly 3. One is that it's leading to very, very polarized politics, and it's happening amid a very, very polarized politics. If politics becomes too much polarized, it actually can worsen. And it's not just a part of the government; it's also part of the responsibility of the social media platforms, which have a very short-term goals. They are driven almost on a regular cycle. It's like today we are on number 1, tomorrow we are number 2. They become 1. It's not like the government. So that's another. It's leading to a lot of competition, at times breakneck competition, and short-circuiting of rules, which is a major, major threat. And it, of course, leads to misinformation, at times the kind of misinformation which the government also doesn't really want at all. And The third major factor is the public communication failures. So many crises we talked about, from SARS to COVID, and not just that, AQI related and climate and pollution related. Tianjin was one big incident which happened in 2015 earlier. There was a huge fire there, so much so that it almost destroyed everything in the 2-kilometer range area. And communication of the government during all these crisis situation has been far from satisfactory, and this has actually worsened the situation. I think how to deal with it. So I think one important advice would be clarity over rhetoric, logic over ideology, and rules, not rumor-driven censorship. So this is it from my end. I think I'll be.
Thank you, Tilak, for that very extensive presentation. Yeah, I think there are some very interesting points that you have looked at and in details, and it gives a lot of clarity. However, there are some. There are some places where I think I would perhaps ask you questions on, like when you're talking about limitations of alternate narratives. I think as far as I have observed and looked, is that there are a lot of alternate narratives in China, and especially the social media platform. And I don't think that there is a short-sightedness. There might be at some level, but otherwise, the social media platforms in China are so vibrant, and actually the kind of discussions that are going on in the social media platform in China, I have not seen that in spite of the censorship, and then they know that they will be censored, and there are keywords, so they keep there are so many innovative ways for them to have these discussions. This is what I have observed personally, and I would like you to tell me if you have also observed the same and what you feel about it. There are so many clever rhetorical use of their use of language in actually not directly talking about the issue, but indirectly creating names. And there are so many nicknames, for example, for Xi Jinping. When they have to talk about Xi Jinping, they don't directly talk about Xi Jinping. And we know that there was, especially during the zero COVID time, when there was a strict surveillance on especially Xinjiang's zero COVID the facts on Xinjiang's COVID situation. It was presented in a very positive way, and how the government is handling it so well. But after the fire broke, we all know that so many Chinese took to the streets. So I agree with you completely that the government is following a very strict surveillance. But I am only saying that the people are actually the power of the people's, Chinese people's creativity and, their courage is also something that I, as a researcher, has looked at. And I feel that we are not talking about a silent public, which is actually under the pressure of this surveillance and are not courageous enough to come out. And they're taking, we have so many arrests, we have so many crackdown, but in spite of that, as I've mentioned in my opening remarks also, there are 100,000 is not a small number, for example, like more than 100,000. So how are they able to escape close surveillance of the government? So even though the government has a very strong system, but on the other hand, the people are also trying to find alternate ways to express and to discuss, and they are not silently sitting there and going through the process of being asked to shut up. So this is my observation. But thank you so much. I think the floor is open for questions. Maybe Varsha.
Oh, yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am, there's a question in the chat box. The question is from Raj Gupta. He has two questions to ask. First, the biggest source of disinformation and misinformation in China are the self-media accounts on platforms such as Baidu, Weibo, and WeChat. Although special campaigns were launched by Ministry of Public Security and Cyberspace Administration of China to rectify them, we still see a lot of misinformation and even disinformation in Chinese online ecosystem. In your view, has the disinformation and misinformation reduced with the advances in AI and other related technologies? Will it reduce further in the future? Ma'am, shall I read the second question as well? Okay. A lot of self-media accounts are also a good source of gathering support for the government on certain issues through their strong nationalistic projection. So with this being the case, how far is the CPC actually willing to rectify self-media accounts?
Tilak, maybe you can respond to this question and to my comment also. And maybe then we can take more questions.
Sure. I think first thing that I would like to point out about the chair's question is that yes, in general, it is true that it would be unfair to say that the Chinese are becoming less expressive. That is not the problem. Chinese have definitely become far more expressive because this is also a country which is far more prosperous, far more free, far more global. They're traveling all across the world. So no doubt that is there. But what has changed and what is something that is a concern for those who see social media as a medium of change, medium to ensure that the government possibly listens to public's concern, is that the collective nature of campaigns. I think that is where the major change is. This has not just happened for that matter in social media. It has happened in case of the way protests were organized maybe earlier, could be organized. That thing is totally changed. So yes, there are at times pockets, at times there are also regional censorship which has been placed. When a keyword is censored today in Shanghai, doesn't mean it will be also censored in Yanqing or in there could be regional censorship. That has become, these are the new tools and technologies. So that is there. So I think what they're definitely trying to prevent and what they have become more successful at is making sure that people are able to express at times, but at the same time, it doesn't attain a collective nature. It doesn't gather a momentum. It doesn't gather, definitely not the momentum leading to protests, not the kind of momentum leading to national protests for sure, or national dissatisfaction with the government for sure. And yes, this is true for that matter, that so many Chinese language is blessed in that sense that they have, and for that matter, thanks to Chinese people, the way they have become so creative in creating new frontiers for the censors. But at the same time, I think we also have to possibly concede that the censors have become far more trained today than they were when they started censoring. And the limitations, exceptions have grown up. And I think for that matter, if you see the 3-year-long lockdown almost, this is phenomenal. And I think we, in most countries, even 2 months, in Western countries, even 1 month was resisted to the extent that most of the government actually gave up. But China was possibly the single country which went on for as long as 3 years. So, and I think it actually went so bad that thereafter the government realized that it's going beyond. They also, but it took so long. This itself is evidence enough that, well, actually, despite the expansion of platforms, despite the expansion of ways of expression, the limitations have been. I think that also leads to the first part of Dad's question about AI and technology, whether it will reduce misinformation and disinformation. AI actually can enable both those who produce information and those who censor information. So those parts are there. I think we talked about deepfake when we started our conversation with. The new recent frontier is about deepfake. Deepfake is the kind of technology which is making impersonation quite feasible, quite easy, quite something that can be almost decentralized. So tomorrow, I think I could be taking up someone's face and just being that person. Such incidences have actually happened. So new technologies. I think in recent years we have also heard about blockchain, which has become the new documentation mechanism. Now, blockchain is not something that people can generally use. That is where the cases related to, for example, Me Too campaigns, some of which were actually documented on blockchains in China, they remained there. But at the same time, as far as the wider public is concerned, it was taken care of. The information or anything which was conversation which would have gathered momentum. Yes, the government is not insensitive. The government also wants people to believe it, where it does act. But what it will do with AI leadership is not to unleash people's creativity. It is to make sure that people believe in the agenda of the government. So their agenda is not to force people into believing in the government. There's an agenda, or for that matter, any government's agenda actually, is to make people believe in it. And AI is a tool which the government is likely to use in its favor more than people will be able to use. And I think this is what we have also seen in recent years. So for that matter, today we are talking about generative AI, and after Chat GPT era, we are possibly more concerned about it, but quite a bit of it, as far as surveillance technology is concerned, were very much inactive during COVID era. So all these AI-enabled camera, all the tracking of people, their mobility data, their payment data, all of it, where you pay, where you travel, what kind of interaction you get into. If all of this is tracked, what else is left? And of course, the social media is something which is very much, there's a strong digital footprint there. So we should not really confuse today's AI as something that is going to change much. We already have very much advanced level of AI, especially in China. They're also applying it. If it actually goes beyond it, then it could be a situation to worry about. So it is about striking a balance where I think the social credit system sort of thing is strengthened and gradually sharpened up. And well, the new generation hopefully is more into propaganda than ever before. That is also there. So despite all the debate, but I think this also possibly brings back to the previous answer, where it is also a generation which is very, very global, very, very empowered, very, very educated. So these are two extremes where a balance needs to be brought in. And I think that's where it's very difficult to predict whether AI will actually limit these spaces. It will likely increase individual spaces, but it will limit collective spaces. And it will definitely limit collective spaces far more than it has done so far. AI is going to make sure that. As far as self-media accounts are concerned, to gather support for the government on certain issues, nationalistic projections, I think I already mentioned one thing is that possibly as far as authentication and verification mechanism is concerned, in case of Chinese social media, this is one of the most rigorous and most comprehensive compared to anywhere else. And that is going to remain the case. The digital tracking is becoming more persistent. There are more AI cameras which are coming up. And this is going to be the case for self-media as well. If something like deep fake technologies or something even more deeper than deep fake comes up, and that is where possibly people continue to have a scope of expressing themselves. So we'll have to wait for that. But I think the way technology grows, this is something very much expected. So there we can expect that this cat and mice game is continue to remain. It's here to stay. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Jha.
Yeah, you just talking about cat and mice game. Actually, it's exactly that. That is what happens, when you have these alternate vocabulary that they're talking about issue, and then it takes some time for the authorities to realize that, okay, they're talking about this, because there is a, it's a double, it's not directly, they have, for example, Xi Jinping himself has so many different names, you know. So Xi Bao, Xi Bao Bao, Xi Tata, Xi Bao Zi, sorry. And then Xi Jinping. Jinping is to restrict any kind of opinion. Jin is to stop or ban. So, and then the moment they realize that the characters are used wrong, and then they immediately, so it's a cat and mice game, as you just mentioned. But then what I'm trying to say is it's interesting that how people are still so, in this, business of actually expressing themselves and wanting to bring in opinion. So when we are talking about directly political issues, yes, they are able to censor it very well, because it is the need of the government to keep up or the party to keep up their legitimacy and all. But when we look at other issues like cultural issues or social issues, like for example, if since I'm looking at gender, so when I look at gender, there are so many phrases which are not directly allowed to, which is the people are actually using, and they're not detected so fast, like in the political arena. So, and they're actually talking about issues and very openly talking about issues, and maybe in some time it is taken off, but it is not so fast. But it is still the cat and mice game, yes. So
it takes a cat to be lazy to let the rat run away. As long as that is not happening, well, you cannot expect a cat to win over rat to win over cat. But yeah,
because it's not just the alternate ways are very interesting and very innovative. So it takes the government authorities it takes time for them to realize that what is actually happening. So I don't know. Yeah. So are there more questions? There are no more questions.
Yes, ma'am. There are no more questions in the chat box.
Okay. Anybody like to ask any questions? So since nobody's asking, maybe I will ask you another question, or maybe more like a discussion that, when we're talking about, as you'd said that, misinformation, and I mean, don't you think the misinformation would also include certain information which are chosen not to be shared, or, perhaps it's not all kind of information is come out with for us, owing to certain purpose. So choice of information. So even that is, do you think it comes under the thing of preview of misinformation or disinformation? Or
see, I think as far as, if you see for that matter, roughly the information which comes from the Chinese government, as far as the rest of the world is concerned, we would often call it almost disinformation. The rest of the world often, especially the Western media, generally tends to call it almost disinformation, to the extent that they're trying to control people. And so this is a matter of perception and how that perception is built. Same information can be just information for you, can be a code for a digital world, can be disinformation or something having a negative impact for somebody. So in that phenomena, if we see the communication and interaction which is emerging from China, inside China as well in particular, because domestic policy tends to reflect in the foreign policy as well. This is a concern which is going to become more prominent in coming years. So I think what we see for that matter, that almost about every dimension, there is an effort to sort of give it a shape, give it an ideological shape, give it a political shape, give it a shape of the kind that the government wants, the leader wants maybe. And that contest, that space to sort of contest is getting limited. I think if you see the today's political space in China, it's possibly far more constrained than most of us have seen in our generation, almost. It is that kind of situation. So this contest is going to remain, and information, how it is dealt. See, every next generation will possibly want more information, more freedom, so that we can rest assured. On that front, the government is going to lag behind. So what the government considers to be very much normal today is not going to be the normal tomorrow. It was not the norm. It was not the normal yesterday. Earlier, all the propaganda was simply taken by the people without any contest. Today there is a contest. Today there is debate. Today, at least, the government realizes even the strategies to control have totally changed. Earlier, I think 30 years ago, just even 30 years ago, till that, individual was not really a concern. Today, individual is a concern. And in case of human domain, individual can be not just one thing, one person. Individual can be something in the technology era. One person alone can, at times, you never know, can do so many things which you can't even imagine. So
I think the
individual is far bigger today, and it is likely to be far bigger in coming. It's going to be bigger in coming times. So this is where the information's many treatment and many dimensions are. Sorry.
No, as you said, the individual is no more an individual, because if an individual is expressing, there'll be others who are, taking the discussion ahead, and also perhaps agreeing or disagreeing, or so that's how the social media works. I mean, another thing that you just pointed out about the new generation. So, as far as I know, all the universities, all the students in China, the young university students, they all can access international, social media, Facebook, Twitter. They have VPNs, and they keep working on it. They keep changing the VPN. It gets cracked down. So it's a constant thing. I think what I again and again am pointing out is that people are not sitting idle, or the new generation, as you said, the newer the generation, the more information they want. And in China, they are actually finding so many ways to do that.
I agree. I think my own roommate was Chinese, 2 years in China. And he used to read Economist and all other newspapers quite a few times. But there are certain advantages, I think, several other advantages. You see, here we are talking in English for that matter, and the kind of stuff that we need to talk, almost everything we can talk in English. In India's case, the natural English comes as a natural language which immediately connects you to the global network of interaction which is taking place. In case of China, it has to have a detour. It has to have to the Chinese version of even international websites for that matter. And I think at times the propaganda is working very favorably. For example, India is presented as a country which is not well managed, and when Trump came, it became a huge debate. Several articles came in that how America is being mismanaged. So yes, they do. The propaganda is not something that's just deleting communication. It's also planting communication. And yes, I think any logical person would agree that so many things which happen in democracies are not things that should actually happen anywhere. So yes, I think there is also an acceptance that so many things which is happening in China there is definitely a legitimacy. Economic prosperity was the legitimacy factor earlier. Now they're trying to shift it towards political, which is not going to be easy, but this is also a time where China is aging. This is also a time where China is under economic pressure. There is also a time where a lot of other external threats are also coming, and I think they are marketing it very well. I think all the rhetoric around Taiwan, or for that matter, US attack on China, all these trade wars, all these technology wars, the Chinese government and the Chinese media is using it to make sure that the nationalism rhetoric remains intact. So it's not just one factor. It's never going to be one factor. We have to trust the Chinese government and its instinct. They have managed it so far. They are going to be very much able to manage, at least in the next, in the coming future that we can foresee. And that is where it seems to stay. Unless there is not a dramatic dramatic, say, red herring sort of incident.
Okay, so if are there any more questions?
Oh, yes, ma'am. We have one more question in the chat box. The question is from Dr. Alpana, who is a business development manager. She asks, has there been any incidents where the government has spread misinformation or disinformation to have an upper hand, like in a few other countries we have seen or heard?
Well, I think it's almost a regular incident with Taiwan or Hong Kong, or for that matter, times India even, and US and Japan and Korea, name it, it's all there. But in Taiwan case, it becomes very, very prominent because that's where the logic, the argument is possibly the sort of counter narrative which comes is the loudest, and that's why we tend to listen it more than others. But it remains as with respect to others as well. For example, United States has always been accused of human rights violation by the Chinese government. Whenever the US releases its human rights violation report against China, usually around the same time, the China also releases a human rights report against the United States. That thing has remained. On border, we definitely see narratives and counter narratives between India and China and Southeast Asian countries and the countries around South China Sea and China. I think that's almost a regular thing. And of course, this is most strident in case of Taiwan. I think recently, at least there have been two news related to the fact that Tsai Ing-wen, who is the Taiwanese president, she wants to run away from Taiwan. This was doing the rounds. So you see, if the people are made to believe that their president is going to run away, well, what are the chances of her getting re-elected, that leader getting re-elected, and what could be the chances of the people not really fearing where it is coming from? So actually, there are several instances of it, many instances against many other countries, Japan, Taiwan, Hong Kong, India, many other places.
I think somewhere it's also an indication that it's not just happening in China.
It's not just happening in China. It cannot just happen in China. This is also a geopolitical game. The legitimacy is something that China doesn't need inside China. Legitimacy is also required beyond China. Our Prime Minister is going all across the world to meet Indians, and I think the Chinese want Chinese all across the world to make sure that their agenda, their national interest is pushed. We do it through a logic which is today more acceptable. I think if China continues to keep its march on, tomorrow the Chinese way of doing things could become mainstream. It has already become mainstream in many ways. So yes, no doubt. So they are seeking domestic legitimacy. They are seeking international legitimacy. And like any country which starts becoming powerful, which has more tools and technologies at its disposal, Chinese have kept on changing their strategies, and they have become more assertive. So I think what they're trying to do now, even inside China for that matter, is not a contest between people and the government. They want to settle it down. At least President Xi definitely wants to settle it down. I think now there is possibly there is something like in CPC that they want it to be accepted almost as a party of natural governance. Now the era of class wars is past. Now they want to go beyond it. And they want to be the ruling class, no doubt about it. And they definitely want to be the rule setter in the global arena as well. That's where all the debates about AI, because historically, countries which have had control over technology and information and propaganda have ruled the world. If so many countries believe today that there's so much of good or bad thing happening in China or in America, it is not just because they have got nuclear bombs and hydrogen bombs. It's also happening because they have got the kind of propaganda mechanism that they have. We do not believe in America just because Americans have got 7th Fleet and 6th Fleet and all these. We believe in because we watch so many American movies. We enjoy so many American serials. We want to go to study in America. So many Indians and many other people. I think that China is not very far from this situation.
That's how the mechanism of propaganda works.
Yes, yes. Propaganda is a comprehensive. It's not just one
Are
thing.
there more questions?
No, ma'am, there are no more questions.
Okay, so there are no more questions. Thank you so much, Tilak, for this very interesting and very thought-provoking presentation. I'm sure everyone would now observe more and try to understand beyond what seemed to be. Thank you. Thank you, Tilak.
Uh, Hi, yes. We have now come to the end of today's Wednesday seminar. I extend my gratitude to Dr. Tilak Jha and Dr. Usha Chandran for sparing moments from their hectic schedule to engage in an intriguing discussion. We at the ICS conduct seminars every Wednesday. We also eagerly invite you to join us for the forthcoming book discussion on World Upside Down, India Recalibrates its Geopolitics by Ambassador Sujan R. Chinoy on Friday, 25th of August. The video of today's discussion will be available on the ICS YouTube platform. Information regarding our weekly seminars can be found on the ICS website, or you can also subscribe to our newsletters for regular updates. Thank